Hello, on today's video for the Cadillac 472-500, I'm going to continue the series on intake manifolds. Today I'm going to talk about the Edelbrock intake manifold. And I'm going to start with a little bit of history. Now, Edelbrock made this intake at Larry Kruzak's request. He kept talking to him at shows and telling them they needed to have an intake. Now, this is back in the 80s when he still worked in California. And so he's really the one reason this intake happened, because Edelbrock really didn't think the motor was much of anything to talk about. And in order to get the intake made, Larry sent him a stock intake, and they measured the distances and figured out the bolt holes and figured out the pattern and then worked up the intake. Now, a lot of guys believe that Edelbrock did a whole bunch of testing with this intake in order to make a better intake for the Cadillac. And they've done that for other motors, but they didn't do that for the Cadillac. This intake went into production with absolutely no dyno time, and they didn't even test fit it onto a motor. All they did was figure everything out from the intake Larry sent them, kind of took what they thought about the 460 intake that they made, and made an intake for the Cadillac. The first one that was cast, they do a preliminary casting, and I had contacts at the time at Edelbrock, but the very first casting went into the Edelbrock Museum, which always happens. The second one went to Larry to see what he thought, and I got the third intake in order to see what I thought, because I knew some of the guys at Edelbrock. And when I got it, I put it on the flow bench, I looked it over real good, I ran it on a motor, and I had some issues. And I used my contacts and worked my way back through Edelbrock to talk to the guy that actually designed and built this. And that's when I found out they had done no dyno testing or anything at all. They considered this intake what they called a street rod intake that looks better and runs okay. So they weren't trying to make an intake that ran way better than the stock intake. Now, on the flow bench, I flowed the intake by itself, and I flowed it on cylinder heads. Now, the intake runner itself flows, depending on which runner you're talking about, because I did them all, flows between 290 and 300 CFM. Now, if you remember me talking about the stock cast iron manifold, and it only flowed 226, you're thinking, oh wow, that flows a lot more. The problem is that the stock intake is low profile. Now remember, the height of the carb is way down. That's why you can't really fit this intake on an Eldorado. It sits up. The factory cast iron intake is super low profile to keep it under the hood on the Eldorado. Because of that, the runner coming out of the head is actually pointed a bit downhill. And if you look at this runner, it's basically pointed in at an angle to the port. So if this one's coming downhill and this one's coming downhill, basically this is running the flow straight into the floor of the stock port. Now what happens when you put this on a head and test it, as opposed to just testing the runner, is you go from that 290, 300 CFM down to 226. Which, funny enough, is the exact same thing that the stock intake flows. So a lot of times, you won't see a big gain by bolting on the Edelbrock. Now, sometimes you see a little bit of horsepower, but that's because it kind of changes where the RPM is tuned for on the intake. Now, if you look, one of the advantages of the Edelbrock, other than it looks better on the motor than that low factory intake, is that you've got two bolt patterns. So you can bolt up a Holley carburetor, You can bolt up an Edelbrock carburetor. You can bolt up a Quadrajet. You got lots of options for carburetors that'll bolt straight up to this intake without any real problems. Now, if you use a square flange like Holly carburetor, I do recommend what's called a squaring plate from Edelbrock. Basically, that just ensures it's just a little thin flat plate. You have a gasket on the bottom, a little thin flat plate, and a gasket on top. And that just ensures you don't get a leak back here on the wide Quadrajet area. And Edelbrock recommends those plates on any of their dual carb flanges in order to make sure. Now, you also can tell, I mean, remember we talked about the stock intake. This actually has a plenum, and it's divided in between the two. That means they're sharing. Just like we talked about on the stock intake, when this runner comes up and draws from the carburetor, it's actually going to draw from both sides just a little bit, depending on how much you cut this down. And this one is, kind of low. So it'll draw from both sides of the carb. Now, one of the advantages of this, and why Edelbrock does this on a lot of their basic intakes, is instead of that 800 CFM Quadrajet, you could run, a 700 CFM or even a 650 probably if you're just doing a driver and not have trouble. You don't need that 800 CFM because this runner is going to see the whole 600 CFM carb as opposed to 400 CFM on the stock intake of just half the Quadrajet. So you can get away, especially on just a driver, with a smaller carb, and that'll help your low end. Now, on some applications with this intake, like airboat or maybe four-wheel drive truck where just off idle is a problem, you might want to fill this in. A lot of the airboat guys weld this in. You can take a divider plate and make a custom divider so that it blocks this off well enough that you don't have this sharing from one side of the intake to the other. And that'll help at just off idle. Now, if you run a smaller carb, the same sort of thing happens because it's really about airspeed through the carb. So if you run a big carb, you might want to divide that. If you run a small carb and you block this off, then it's really all about just off idle. The intake will peak and you'll be done. And if you're not trying to go over 4,000 RPM, that'll be just fine. Now, the Edelbrock intake is slightly better than a stock intake. And if you look at the dyno testing done at Cadco, you will find that he's managed to get some fair amount of power. Now, like I said, the runner flows pretty good, 290, 300 CFM. So the runner itself is better than stock. Now, there is a little bit of a restriction right here where the two ports come together. And on some of the high output motors, Cadco has one that's modified where they go in and make this a little wider and try and get the transition from the carb to the runners a little bit better. But the first thing, before you get to that, is if you can slightly raise, and there is not a lot of room here. Let me kind of flip this over. There is not a lot of room at the top of that port. But even if you can only go up like another 50 thousandths of an inch, there's a bump on the head that's pointing the air down. If you can raise that bump even just a little bit, you start getting above that 226 CFM. So if you can raise this port just a bit, raise the port in the head just a bit, you can gain more horsepower over the stock intake because this runner will support it. Now, if you did that with a stock one, nothing would happen because it's designed for that uphill, and the runner itself doesn't flow any more than the runner in the head does. And like I said, this is 290, 300. If you port a set of Cadillac heads, That's about what this runner size is. Most of the time you can get, on a ported head, you can get about 290 CFM. And that's about what the runner is. And so that actually works out. The only thing you're really fighting is that last little half inch in the runner to try and get that bump out. And the only way you can improve it is to either try and raise the intake up a little bit, maybe go to a bit of a thicker gasket so that this rides up a bit, or port it just a smidge. Like I said, don't go so thin that you can't get it to seal, but the runner will support it if you can get up there. And so it's a good match except for this transition. Now, transition points like this in other motors are a problem too. Almost always when you bolt an intake to a head, you will lose about 7% or so. Now, some are worse than others. And that's this transition usually from the angle of the runner, and you can see they're not all the same, but the angle of the runner into the angle of the port. And so you always lose a little bit. But with Cadillac, you're losing quite a bit. And like I said, it's because it's that Eldorado downhill port. And that's what the boogeyman heads try and fix. That's why it raises the port up and tries to fix that transition point. But even like I said, if you're using cast iron, you can do a little bit. If you run your finger in the port, you can feel that bump. And you just, every bit of that bump you can take out, the better off you are, until you reach the flow of the runner. And then that's going to be about it. So on the Edelbrock intake, it is a little bit bigger than stock. It is a way lighter intake. I mean, you're not fighting that 45-pound intake. And you can bolt on different carbs. This also lets you look better. I mean, it looks like more of a normal engine if it's going in something other than an Eldorado where you have extra hood clearance to put this in. So that's the basic Edelbrock. And it hasn't changed in all the years. They're all the same. They're still using the same casting that they used in the 80s. We're on, I don't know, run 5 or run 6 or run 7 or something of intakes. And they're all the same. So that's the Edelbrock intake. And that's the gist of it. And I wish you luck in all your stuff. And choose your parts wisely. I'll talk to you later. Bye.